Hello and welcome to our program. My name is Mark Kligman. I am the Interim Director of the Eunice and Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. The Nazarian Center is situated in UCLA's International Institute. Our center provides academic discourse that addresses Israel's history and culture, both past and present. Today's program is co-organized with the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University, and I'm very happy that we are able to do this program together. And it is co-sponsored by the UCLA Meyer and Renee Luskin Department of History, the UCLA Department of Geography, the UCLA Program in Digital Humanities, and the UCLA Center for Middle Eastern Development. What we will do today is have a presentation by Dr. Daniel Stein-Koken with his new Digital Humanities All the Points project. He will present first, and then we will have two respondents. So I will introduce everyone first, and then our program will begin. Dr. Daniel Stein-Koken is a Jewish and Israeli studies scholar affiliated with Arizona State University and the Ramaz Upper School in New York City. In 2024-2025, this academic year, he is a fellow in the Advanced Israel Studies at Brandeis University's Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. He has previously taught at Yale, at UCLA, the University of Oregon, the University of Greifswald in Germany. He has also had fellowships from Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Study in Florence, other places as well. He has numerous publications, and from 2015 to 2019, he was associated with the Nazarian Center and UCLA. Welcome back, Daniel. Our first respondent will be a leading scholar in the field of Israel studies, Yael Zerubbabel, who is Professor Emerita of Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers University, where she previously served as the founding director of the Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life. I had many opportunities when I lived in New Jersey to partake of the center, and so wonderful to see you, Yael. She is the author of the widely acclaimed books, Recovered Roots, as well as Desert in the Promised Land. In addition, Zerubbabel has undertaken important work in the field of Israeli culture, cultural memory, Jewish immigrant experience, Jewish memory, Jewish space, and the trauma in Israeli culture. Our next respondent will be Alexander Kay, who is the Carl, Harry, and Helen Still Associate Professor of Israel Studies. Helen Stoll, Associate Professor of Israel Studies and Director of the Schusterman Center at Brandeis. He studies the history of Jewish thought with a focus on political thought, the history of law and theories of Jewish modernity. He's also an expert in Israel studies and focuses on the history of Israel and its relationship with law, religion, politics, particularly in the history of religious Zionism. We're really excited about today's program, and after all these presentations, we'll take your questions, so really feel free to put your questions in the chat. Without further ado, Dr. Daniel Stein-Koken.
So thank you so much for the kind introduction and for this great opportunity to introduce and discuss all the points. It's especially meaningful to me that this event is jointly sponsored by the Nazarian and Schusterman Centers. After all, I began this project during the years in which I had the great privilege of teaching courses about Israel at UCLA, and this launch now comes at the close of an academic year in which I had the honor of being a fellow at Brandeis. So I want to start by thanking both centers, and especially the Nazarian Center and its recent and current directors, Yoram Cohen, Dov Waxman, and Mark Kligman, for providing the seed funding to get all the points rolling. There are many other individuals and organizations who have provided assistance over the years, but I want to highlight in particular here a few people. My dedicated programmer, Solomon Vimal, who we'll hear from a bit later on, Alex Kay and Yael Zerubbabel, who are kindly here with us today, Brian Roby of the University of Michigan, Reuven Gaffney of Kinneret College, Shaul Arieli of Reichman University, the Israel Central Bureau of Statistics, and the late great scholar, diplomat, and ambassador Martin Indyk. And of course, thanks to all those who have zoomed in wherever and whenever you are for your time and interest. The primary goal of All the Points is twofold: to highlight both the extraordinary diversity in the kinds of communities found in the modern Israeli-Palestinian region, as well as the extensive change over time in terms of what communities have existed there. I think one is pressed to find a place where these two features are so present. And we can just quickly compare the situation in 1840, we'll talk more about these maps later, and 2023. We've experienced in this time period the founding of over 1,000 new Jewish communities, the disappearance of hundreds of Arab and also some Jewish locales, emergence of a number of new Arab communities as well, and tremendous diversity of ideological, religious, and social among Jewish communities, kibbutzim, moshavim, Haredi cities, development towns, etc., and also tremendous diversity within the Arab community, Bedouin, Christian, different sects of Christianity, Druze, etc. And there, of course, communities, as we'll get to, that are neither Jewish nor Arab in the land as well. And however one feels about this diversity and these changes, there is a remarkable and fascinating and often tragic human story to study here. Indeed, the events of the present day oblige us, I would say, to do so. The name All the Points is inspired by the rhetoric of classical Zionism, according to which new communities were often referred to by the Hebrew nekuda, or point. And the original proposed name for Kibbutz Afikim, near the Kinneret Sea of Galilee, was actually Tochka, Russian for point. As additional communities were founded, they were referred to as Od Nekudot ala Mapa, additional points on the map. And probably the most famous such occasion being Achadasar HaNekudot, or the 11 points, founded in the Western Negev in the single night of October 5th through 6th, 1946, which happened to be right after Yom Kippur. Among those points were two about which we have tragically heard a great deal recently, the kibbutzim Be'eri and Nirin. In subsequent decades, this rhetoric of points has been both intensified and criticized. Between 1980 and 2010, the official publication of Amanah, the settlement arm of the national religious Gush Emunim, or Block of the Faithful, was entitled, and I imagine you can see this coming, Nekuda. And in case you missed the point, the title itself adds one at its end. Nekuda, Nekuda. Point, point. The point, that is settlement, was the point. But at the same time, this discourse has been turned completely on its head in a 1995 song by the popular rock band T-Pex, in which government bureaucrats, concerned by the absence of a point down at the bottom of the map, Sham lemata chasera od nekuda, decree the founding of Ma'ale Avak. The song, also called Ma'ale Avak, commemorates the challenges faced by people sent to forlorn new places like this fictional one, and is sung by a band whose members themselves hailed from the Israeli periphery or peripheria. Ma'ale, which means ascent, mimics the exalted name of many an Israeli town and neighborhood. There are ma'ales all over the place, even a ma'alot. But of course, it's utterly ridiculous to have a place called ascent at the country's very bottom, and ma'ale avak as an expression connotes giving off dust, and so is not terribly auspicious. And how perfect that a band whose name means whiteout in Hebrew mocks the multiplication of points on the national map. Ma'ale Avak has directly inspired a particular element of this project, and so I'll come back to it briefly later. T-Pex satire anticipated sentiments set out in an academic article by the Israeli architect and scholar Sharon Rothbard in the early 2000s, where he bemoaned that Israel's tendency to refer to newly established communities as settlement points hints at the fact that the point on the map was more important than the settlement itself, and by extension, the people who inhabited that settlement. And that's exactly the point of the song Ma'ale Avak. So in creating All the Points and naming it as I have, I'm drawing upon and in dialogue with all of these above points, and indeed with the discourse of points writ large. All the points, I call it all the points, because the aim is to include and value all the lives and stories of all the peoples who have inhabited and or founded communities in this land in the modern era. This, of course, includes Arabs and Jews, but also others. Perhaps you're familiar with the European Christians, like the Templars from southwestern Germany, who founded colonies near Haifa, Jerusalem, Jaffa, and elsewhere in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, or aware of these two Circassian villages in Israel's north. Circassians are non-Arab Muslim people from the Caucasus. But did you know that Caesarea was a Bosnian village, between 1880 and 1948, populated by Bosnians who fled Mostar when it was conquered by the Austro-Hungarian Empire? And I could go on and on. So in naming the map precisely for its points, my intention is that even as the map powerfully tells the story of the region in the aggregate, so I hope, it will also inspire interest in these varied communities that make up the land and their inhabitants and their stories. And on the topic of the inhabitants of the land and their stories, when I first undertook this project quite some years ago, even as I was documenting the emergence and disappearance of numerous points on and from the map, it never dawned on me that such tremendous destruction and displacement would transpire in real time, as has been the result of October 7th and its aftermath. For many months after that day, I was in fact unable to work on the project at all. And still, the great loss of people and points on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian divide clouds the project in a cast of mourning. At the same time, the events of the past 569 days render a project like this all the more important, I think, and so we press on. And speaking of pressing on, just a few more quick points before we get to the map itself. Well aware that one enters a minefield the moment one attempts to do anything relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I have made a number of choices to hopefully minimize, if of course not eliminate, the potential for rancor. And I guess we'll find out with what success. First, in opting to start the map with 1840, that's the first year that we document on the map, I have selected a year of historical significance. It was when the Ottoman Empire regained control over Palestine, but one that arouses little to no controversy in the present. Two, I had originally intended to keep tracking changes up to the present moment, but the complexity of doing so in the post-October 7th world has led to the decision, for now at least, to take the map up to just prior to the war. For all the controversy the war has provoked and provokes, I think all parties agree as to its significance. As you have seen, I have officially named the project in Arabic and Hebrew, in addition to English. And as you have already heard me say, I refer to the territory in question here, the land in question here, as the Israeli-Palestinian region, thereby focusing on the primary peoples present there for most of the period covered by the project, but sidestepping political status and boundaries. I have no expectation that everyone will be satisfied by what the project does or by how it positions itself, but I do hope that people will appreciate the efforts that have been made to think carefully about it. And I also want to highlight that I welcome corrections, additions, and suggestions of all kinds, indeed on all points. And on the website, which you'll get access to at the close of this program, one can access a form to submit that feedback. And now let's get on to some points. So I just want to note that what I'm showing here is a brand new application developed by my programmer and his company, GeoThara, and that we also have, I'll just show this briefly, and I just want to make sure you can see now the website, correct?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. And that we also have the older versions that were produced provisionally using ArcGIS. So you really have your choice of which you use. And ArcGIS here, the ArcGIS map actually exists in two forms, basic and advanced. The basic map just uses colors to distinguish amongst the different communities. You can see here, I'm on the ArcGIS map right now, you can see the layers on the left. But this advanced map where I am also uses shapes to delineate, to differentiate among certain subcategories within a major population or community category. So in the case of Arab communities, different shapes distinguish between Arab villages, cities, or towns, majority Druze communities, Bedouin communities, unrecognized and recognized communities in the Israeli state, Palestinian refugee camps, and so forth. If I go back to the Geothara map, you can see on the left side you have the legend delineating all the different communities represented and the color and shapes in which they are. And then on the right, you can see different choice of base maps that you can use, and we'll come to that actually in just a moment. So you see, of course, at the time, most of the communities in historic Palestine were populated by Arabs. You do see, though, various points that are half blue and half green, and those denote mixed cities. For much of the 19th century, the vast majority of the Jewish population was in these major urban centers: Jerusalem, Haifa, Tiberias, Safed in the north, also in Peki'in, a smaller village in the north. And as we come into this period of time, you can actually see here in what's today the Gaza Strip, one of these mixed cities. Right around the early 1870s, Jewish community was revived in Gaza City. And you see this white point right near the coast. That's denoting, actually, I'm going to just zoom in a little bit. So that denotes Mikveh Yisrael, the first agricultural school that was founded in 1870, a really starting point for the Jewish effort to return to the land. You know what? I'm actually going to go to the ArcGIS map as we head into the 1870s. We see. You start to see yellow points emerging. I'll zoom in a little bit more here. These are the earliest moshavot, the first Jewish farming colonies, mainly in the coastal plain, as you see here, and then in the far north of what is today Israel. Here you see these two white squares. Those are the two Circassian communities that I mentioned before. The magenta points, those are the colonies founded by European Christians. And as we head into this white dot on the coast there, that's Caesarea, the Bosniak village that I referred to before. Just east of today's Tel Aviv, you can see a yellow point. That's Petach Tikva, Em HaMoshavot, considered the mother of the Moshavot. Just want to go back quickly. 1895, you see a yellow circle way out in Syria in the Haran. That's not a mistake. There actually was an effort to settle that region. There were actually 5 colonies founded there, but they only lasted a few years. I've only put one on so far because I haven't been able to confirm exactly the locations of the others. In any case, as we head deeper into the 20th century, we see the red right along the southwestern shore of the Kinneret, marking the founding of Degania, the first kibbutz. And in the ensuing years, we'll see the spread of the kibbutz. And you start to see black as well. Those are the moshavim. The kibbutzim, of course, are the collective farms, and the moshavim are sort of more hybrid. They're still collective to some degree, but not to the extent that the kibbutzim were. And this all continues to spread as we enter into the 1920s. Especially in the 1920s, we start to see really a concentration of communities in the Jezreel Valley. In the north, Emek Yisrael emerges really as the first important block of Jewish settlement, enabling Natan Alterman to sing Mi Beit Alpha ad Nahalal, from Kibbutz Beit Alpha to Moshav Nahalal, in his famous Song of the Valley, Shir HaEmek, from the mid-1930s. And indeed, as we come to the mid-1930s, what starts to be visible here is the end of settlement. I'll zoom in a little bit more, so it's that scholars sometimes refer to Jewish communities along the coastal plain, and then in the northern valleys. The Jezreel Valley is mentioned, and then further to the east. Also, by the late 30s and into the 40s, it's becoming increasingly clear that the land is destined for some form of partition, and so we can see efforts made to extend the Jewish footprint to the extent possible. So, for example, as we come into the 40s here, you see efforts to found communities in the Negev. Then, as we come to the War of Independence, or Nakba, 47, 48, 49, we see quite dramatically on the map the sudden disappearance of the hundreds of Palestinian villages that were casualties of that conflict. And then in the early years of Jewish statehood, we see just a tremendous proliferation of Jewish communities across the country, especially in peripheral areas of the new state of Israel, as the country attempted to both solidify its borders and accommodate hundreds of thousands of immigrants. As we continue to move forward in time, we start to see in the 70s the beginnings of efforts to settle the West Bank, initially in the Jordan Valley, along the border with what became the border with Jordan. And then as we move later into the 70s and into the 80s, increasingly, of course, in the Central Highlands. Also notable in this period are the founding of communities, mitzvim or lookouts, new Jewish communities in the Galilee, parts of which had not had so much Jewish presence up until that time. Just want to also point out the changing nature of settlement as we pass through these decades. You see a lot of orange dots on the map. Those are Nahal outposts, which were combined military and agricultural communities that then get transformed later on into civilian communities. And you increasingly see purple dots, purple points. These represent the Yishuvim Kehilatiyim, or community settlements, which are more individual-oriented, rural, non-farming communities that do screen potential new residents. So they have something of a social nature, but they increasingly replace the more collective kibbutz and semi-collective moshav as we head into the 70s, 80s, and beyond. And I'll just let it play a little bit, and you can see, and this works very nicely on both maps. The new GeoThara map is actually far superior in terms of its latency, but it's so new, I'm just not as familiar with it yet. So I'm showing you this one, but I invite you to play around with both on the website. So I'll just point out various features that you have. You can go, as you've seen, you can migrate backwards and forwards in time on both maps. I'll go back to the GeoThara map. So in any case, in both cases, you can filter out if you're interested in particular kinds of communities. So say you're mainly interested actually in Arab communities. I'm actually going to go back to the PowerPoint right now, and I hope that can be seen. Say you're interested primarily in Arab communities, so you can filter everything out and just examine the Arab population. Say you're interested in the history of the kibbutz, you can filter everything out and just basically watch the kibbutz as it is founded and then spreads throughout the country and then retracts somewhat in more recent years. One feature that is not quite implemented yet, but we're very close to enabling it, is the possibility of filtering down to specific kinds of communities. Say you're interested in just looking at Bedouin Arab communities or just religious kibbutzim. That should be possible very soon. As you explore, and again, you can click on any point to learn more about it, you can learn unexpected or sometimes surprising things. You might, for example, encounter Wadi Hammam, a Bedouin village just west of the Kinneret. Here you see a beautiful shot of it. I want to credit Moshe Sherf, his aerial photography. This is a village that came into being in 1948, actually, for Bedouin who had previously lived further north in the Hula Valley. They were displaced from there, made their way further south, and founded this village, which still exists today. Or you might see that you might encounter Khirbet al-Jalama, which was located in the Triangle or Meshulash region, and was actually only depopulated in March of 1950, after the War of Independence had concluded. The village was actually located in territory that was transferred to Israel from Jordan as part of the Rhodes Agreement that ended the war. We know now of a number of cases of this where smaller Arab communities, even into the early 50s, were basically the residents where the villages were cleared to make way for Jewish communities. In this case, Kibbutz Lahavot Haviva. To stick with the era of the War of Independence, or Nakba, you can see Jewish communities that were lost as a result of the conflict as well. Here far on the right, you see highlighted in the blue circle, Kibbutz Beit Arava, which was in the Arava and the Jordan Valley, just north of the Dead Sea. Or you can look at the Israeli communities that existed in the Sinai Peninsula in the 1970s. Shalhevet on the Gulf of Suez was Israel's oil town between 1971 and 1975. I'll just note that for territories like the Sinai and the Golan that extend beyond the confines of British Mandate Palestine, the map doesn't include the non-Jewish communities that were there, just the Israeli ones. Though we are working on a separate map of the Golan, which I'll come to in a few minutes, which intends to trace the very complicated and very diverse modern settlement history of that strategic plateau. One of my favorite features is the ability to choose different base maps reflecting both different political moments and proposals. So, for example, you can superimpose the Peel Commission proposal from 1937 on the communities that existed at that point in time as a way of trying to understand what the commission was trying to resolve, how they were trying to resolve the conflict between Arabs and Jews in Mandate Palestine. And you can do the same thing 10 years later with the UN partition plan and see how changes in the ground that had taken place in the ensuing decade led to a very different proposal. Jumping ahead, you can, for example, revisit the failed 2000 Camp David negotiations and compare sort of an overarching map with, again, what the settlement situation was on the ground. Or you can, again, take a look, revisit the Trump vision for peace from just a few years ago. So that gives you a sense of what the possibilities you have with the various base maps. I now want to turn to another feature of the project, because alongside this main map, we are in the process of producing a number of curated maps. Some of them are already active, some are still in development. So, for example, I showed you, and here I'm revisiting the European Christian colonies map that I showed before. In the middle, I referred earlier to the Nachal hybrid military and agricultural outposts, and we have a map that actually documents that whole stage in the development of Israel and the founding and then civilianization of these communities, especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Home on the Hilltop places the settlement drive on the West Bank beginning in the late 70s with the founding of communities in the Galilee at around the same time, putting into dialogue two parts of the history that are typically seen as separate. And then I referred just a moment ago to the complicated settlement history on the Golan Heights. Here's just a set of schematic images, basically just showing how this unfolded. But basically, as of 1878, there were no settled communities on the plateau. By May 1967, there were hundreds of villages. Only 5 of them, 4 Druze, 1 Alawite, survived that conflict. And then obviously in the intervening years, there's been a modest Israeli settlement drive on the Golan Heights. I should note that of the communities that emerged between the late 19th century and the Six-Day War, you had a really quite diverse population, Turkmenians, Alawites, Christian Arabs, Druze, and so forth. And the map that we're working on is actually trying to document that rich diversity. Want to just, before I conclude, refer to two other maps. One called Wall and Tower documents a sort of iconic phase in the pre-state history of Israel, the founding against the backdrop of the Arab Revolt between 1937 and 1939 of 57 kibbutzim and moshavim, typically in the cover of darkness. And the movement is called Wall and Tower because, as you can see from all the adjacent photos, these communities were basically just founded as literally a frontier sort of wall and a water tower in the midst, and then grew from there. And most of these communities still, in fact, exist today. And then finally, my personal favorite of these curated maps is called Points That Never Were. And I said before that I would come back to the T-Pex song Ma'alei Avak, and here it is. It was really Ma'alei Avak, which again is about a fictional community located somewhere way down south in Israel, that inspired me to attempt to create a map of imagined communities, points that only exist in works of literature, music, or film. So, for example, on this map, you can visit Neudorf, an idealized farming community that Theodor Herzl fantasizes in Alt-Neuland. Or you can visit Beit HaTikva in Israel's south, the subject of the hit Broadway musical and the Israeli film before that, The Band's Visit, Bikur HaTizmoret, and so forth. There are many, many of these communities, and actually something that I've been working on this year is supplementing the list that I've already have been working on for some time of Jewish fantasized communities with Palestinian ones. And so I hope that ultimately this map will actually be basically a fantasy map of the Israeli-Palestinian region representing both perspectives. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here. I look forward to further discussion. I'll just say that really the goal of the map is first and foremost to be a pedagogical resource. I'm hopeful that it'll find use in classrooms, university classrooms, potentially high school classrooms, and also elsewhere, and also help inform individuals who just want to understand a little bit more the region, how we got to where we are today, and so forth. And it's my sincere hope that people, even people on very different sides of the political spectrum, will find it useful. Indeed, I would say that I hope not only that they'll find it useful, but I hope that my hope is that it will actually challenge people on both sides of the political spectrum as well. And now I actually want to introduce my programmer. You heard him briefly a few minutes ago, Solomon Vimal. And I want to just say briefly about Solomon. He holds a PhD from UCLA and has been recognized with the Norman Medal, the highest annual award given to one paper from the American Society of Civil Engineers. He's a geographer and a hydrologist, and also a very gifted computer programmer. And more recently and currently, he's the founder and CEO of GeoThara, a spatial data science company specializing in complex scientific communication, environmental analytics, and IA-driven trend detection. And again, it's really moving over into the GeoThara map that Solomon and his team recently created for all the points. So I'm going to conclude here, and I invite Solomon to just tell us a little bit about his experience working on the project for a few minutes. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to continued discussion.
All right, thank you so much, Daniel. So I graduated from UCLA in the year 2022, and I had the wonderful opportunity to meet Daniel in 2019 through my partner who introduced me to this project from the Digital Humanities program at UCLA's Germanic Studies. And as soon as I met Daniel, I realized, this project has, such a huge implication. And it was at that point, the things were not so volatile yet. I didn't know very much about the Middle East history, but I really appreciated the opportunity to work on this project. And, it was a summer project in the beginning. But over time, though, my engagement with the project, systematically increased. At one point, perhaps 2 years later in the summer fellowship, I had a plan at one point to travel to Israel to visit the National Library of Israel and perhaps even learn Hebrew or Arabic to try and learn a little more about the region and try and have this region as a special interest, because I have training in mapping and geography very broadly. But fundamentally, I'm a climate scientist that works with lots of mathematical models and to tell various kinds of stories with data. So working with this project, especially after what's happened in 2023, one is confronted with a double paradox. On the one hand, there are homecoming stories and displacement stories on the both sides. And it is somewhat heartbreaking for someone who constantly engages with the data to understand the realities in a somewhat objective and disinterested way, but also see what's happening in the news, as we all know. I want to take 1 minute of my 5-minute speech to share the product one more time, some of the new changes and the rationale behind building this to start with. So the main point I want to make is when we tell stories of, especially of 200 years, sometimes we have to make a trade-off of going for depth versus breadth. But what we've seen in the content creation world, in social media, Instagram, TikTok, and places like that, if you're able to tune up the speed to, let's say, 30 seconds, 30 frames per second, we almost reach a point of stop motion animation. Disney movies are kind of told because the human eye cannot even detect the change. And when we tell stories with looking at it from a distance, looking at it from nearby, clicking on the points and understanding the individual stories in detail and looking at them from different perspectives and different speeds, we understand a lot more about the true complexities of the story, which, in the traditional way, reading books or even watching lectures, we cannot really process information the same way. I think ultimately this is the power of the modern tools that are being built right now. And there is something to be said about also the role of AI in the future. There is a great divide in the world about should we use technology and mathematics and tools like that to remove somewhat the very complex narratives here. But my personal conviction is that it comes from a poetry from my region. The eyes represent two different parts of the interpretation of the world. One is the letters and one is the numbers. And I think computation and AI represent the numbers, and everything else, the qualitative and narrative description, are the letters. But really, when we combine the two, do we truly see the world for its complexities? And with that, I really thank Daniel and the Nasserian Center for giving me this wonderful opportunity. And yeah, I'm happy to take any questions later on or do a private demo for anybody who's interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Solomon.
Thank you both very much. And our first response will be from Yael Zerubbabel.
Well, I'm very glad to be part of the launching of this project. I heard about it from Daniel, meeting him in one of the conferences. I don't remember now when and how long ago, but it's definitely been a while. And I really applaud you for your persistence in pursuing it, but also about your thoughtfulness and the breadth that you bring to this project, which is really what attracted my attention from the beginning. So I don't have much time to respond, and I want just to bring up a few points. First, the name of the project, Kol HaNekudot, or all the points. It is one of the things that really represents the insightful approach to this project, because Daniel is able to see both the power and the limitations of the concept of Nekuda, which comes from the perspective of the map. And this is a very particular angle that has emerged in Israeli culture and is very representative of the rise of the map as an instrument, as both a geographical and a political instrument, and the importance of the settlement discourse in the region. So the creation of this map as that has both a diachronic perspective and a synchronic perspective brings to the foreground really a very important dimension. We can look at the development of the settlements and various settlements. This is really the uniqueness and the power and the promise of this map, that it is an inclusive map that does not focus only on one period or on one sort of settlement of one group, either within the national perspective or within that, but really on the different types and communities and along a historical dimension. What the map does, which historical studies have more trouble doing, is providing a visual realization of historical processes. The visual representation by itself is not sufficient. Of course, you do need the narratives and the analysis and the historical studies that go with it. But on the other hand, it can bring to the readers, to onlookers, the scholars, students, regular people. You don't have to be a scholar in order to understand the benefit of this map. It makes it possible to visually see the historical development of the settlement, as well as, if you follow the study of history or you follow the news even, you can see what the issue of settlement has brought into the history and the politics of the area of this region, which Daniel calls Israel-Palestine in order to be inclusive, and it is a very important dimension, which otherwise is hard to follow. I myself really kind of have an intersection with this work through my own a book, Desert in the Promised Land, where I tried to analyze the complexity of the desert and the settlement, the Jewish settlement relationship, and within it provide different approach to the desert, but in my analysis of the settlement discourse, trying to see its really primacy in Israeli history and its implication for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So within that, I would like to say that the ability in courses, future courses, and in scholarship to be able to follow what Daniel tried to show in the map would be a really important educational tool. But it also means that this is really an ongoing project, and that there are questions that are complex questions, and that you will probably need to cope with them. And I have to say, I cannot really at this point say that I've used the map and can really discuss the complexity from within the map. I can kind of project from knowing the topic what could become issues to think how you represent them in the map. So for instance, what is the status of a settlement or nekuda, a point? There is here a tension between the legal status and the communal status, and it's both on the side of Jewish settlements that, you know, are maybe illegal settlements or started as illegal settlements, both within the frame of the Israel pre-1967 or the Green Border and in the territories. And there is no doubt that, you know, this is something that you are aware of, but there at some point, I'm not sure that this is where it's now, but at some point I remember seeing that you put in the same category as settlements on the top of the hill, which is a definitely legitimate category in terms of the geography and the history of a settlement, but you put together the Mitzpim in the Galilee and the settlements on the hills, top of the hills, beyond the Green Border, and there, you know, putting them together kind of obscures the difference between the legitimacy of these settlements. So I'm not sure that's the status now. Maybe it's a bit anachronistic what I'm saying, but it's the kind of issues that would become subject to scrutiny, and that there are no easy answers about them, but at the same time, they have to be marked. I did notice that you marked the unrecognized Bedouin settlements, which has been a big issue, which I also discuss in my book, Desert in the Promised Land. Along the same lines, I'm not sure what you have done with borders. Now, you may say that there is a deliberate reason not to show borders because you want to focus on the settlements and the fluidity of the situation. On the other hand, such a decision does have a political meaning and can be construed in different ways. So I'm not saying I know that there is an absolute answer to that, but this may become an issue. I will finish just with marking two things that I really think are manifestation of your ability to be inclusive and really sort of also a scholarly imagination that I do appreciate as a student of culture. The fact that you have put in the fictional communities And fictional, I mean both in film or in fiction. And I think that it's marvelous, and it's really so much enriches this for people who are beyond the study of the historical reality, but trying to understand historical imagination and fictional imagination. And along the same lines, also the fact that you included the plans, whatever the plans are, whether they materialized exactly or not, whether it's the Peel Committee or Camp David, I think that that's very important, because that becomes another way of understanding the political interventions in the development of the settlement. So with this, I will conclude, and I'm really looking forward to how it continues. I know that it will remain in work in progress, in the sense that one always finds new information, and I think it's fine. That's part of the nature of such a project, and we all should be grateful to you for launching it. Thank you.
So our next respondent is Alexander Kay.
Thank you so much. I want to firstly just express my gratitude and my delight in being able to support and to introduce this magnificent project to the world. It's a great thing always for the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis to work together with the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA, and it's an especial pleasure to do it in the honor of and the launch of a project of such major importance. So thank you so much to Professor Kligman and to my esteemed co-panelists whose work I've followed for so many years. I'm very glad to be here. I should also mention that we were very happy to have Daniel as a fellow at the Schusterman Center's Institute for Advanced Israel Studies this year, which devoted an entire year to something called Digital Humanities in Israel Studies, which is the introduction of the use of computer technologies in application to humanities research. And for that reason, I just wanted to start my very brief comments with a bit of historical contextualization of the kind of larger movements in historical research out of which this project emerges. And I think there are two kind of, they're referred to in the scholarship often as two turns in historical research that create in their confluence projects like this. So the first turn that I see as a sort of background context to all of the points is the spatial turn in historical research. And the spatial turn has been going on, well, depends who you ask, but for much of the second half of the 20th century, and it continues. It's a realization that where things take place, the geography of historical events, is not just an extra piece of information that you can attach to the historical event, but it actually impacts that, it impacts history in a substantive way. In other words, as many historians have pointed out, space is both effective. In other words, it makes a difference where things take place. Space is also affective. In other words, the way that human beings and their cultures and their communities interact with space and imagine space affects the mood, the way that people feel about their identities and their place in the world in really significant ways. So that's the first turn, the spatial turn. The second turn is, of course, the digital turn. And I think in the past, probably no more than a year, maybe two, many people, when they think of the digital turn, will think of AI and artificial intelligence. But of course, the digital turn in historical studies and humanities in general goes back much further, many, many decades. For many decades, historical and literary and sociological and other kinds of researchers have been using computer technology to do things that you essentially cannot do without computer technology. One of the earliest examples of the way that computers were used in the humanities was in reading, in literary studies. Even the biggest expert in a literary field can only read in the course of an entire lifetime, maybe a few hundred books in a field. Whereas, of course, computers can read tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of books in a very short period of time, and also apply all kinds of mathematical analyses to those works. So I see this fantastic project as the outcome of a confluence of the spatial and the digital turns as they are applied to the study of the Israel-Palestinian region, to use Dr. Stein-Koken's terminology. And I will say that there is no project that even approaches, even gets close to what this project has achieved. As somebody that teaches about Israel a great deal, one is always hard-pressed to find maps that don't have in them, already built into them at the beginning, some kind of ideological argument. Not to say they don't exist, but they are few and far between. And to have a map which is has this amount of data, which is bends over backwards to be as inclusive and neutral as possible, being neutral to the being infinitely neutral is something that's ultimately impossible, but bends over backwards to make sure that is one of the key sort of identified goals of the project. This is just a game-changing innovation in not just historical research, but also the pedagogy of this entire field. And we owe you a great debt of thanks for that. I wanted to offer a couple of sort of constructive critiques, but actually all of these will end up being, as you'll very quickly see, are you know, little notes of, wouldn't it be great if in the future you managed to do X? And of course, the project is, although you've been working on it very, very hard for some years, it's still in its nascent stages. So these are kind of suggestions and thoughts for the future. The first is a methodological point. We've talked a lot about neutrality, and one of the great virtues of this project is the fact that it essentially presents data in this kind of visual medium, which makes it accessible in a different kind of way to researchers and students alike. And simply the collation of this quantity of data is itself a major contribution. The question that I raised earlier about neutrality, though, is whether neutrality can, in some contexts, kind of undermine itself. So, for example, if you have a map that shows a number of Palestinian villages that are there in 1947, let's say, and then are not there in 1949, but that change is presented without comment, because if you added a comment, it would automatically be an ideological comment. But the absence of the comment is also ideological, of course, meaning that no fact exists without comment or understanding. And of course, I could make the same point of, I don't know, Jewish settlements that are in Gaza in 2005 and not in Gaza in 2006, or whatever it is, and we can multiply examples of this. I don't have a suggestion of a way around this problem, but it is a question that I think is worth visiting and revisiting. Two more small points before I finish. One is, and this is something I teach my students a lot when we talk about digital visualizations of historical data. You make, and I can see Dr. Weimel's contributions here as well, but I know that you have worked on this for some years beforehand as well. You make very brilliant use of different kinds of visual modalities to represent different kinds of information. So you use shape, you use color, you of course use spatial location on the map. But one thing that you don't make use of is the size of your points. And you know, it's always a challenge to represent this amount of information without becoming kind of busy or overwhelming. And of course, the question is, where do you get the data of exactly how many people lived in a particular community at a particular time? So again, I understand the absence of size here, but I wonder if down the line that's something that could be revisited. And my final point is simply this. I think that this project is so immensely powerful that I would love down the line, maybe it's through crowdsourcing or sandboxing or other kinds of ways that we can incorporate large numbers of people working on a project like this together, under the watchful eye of expert curators. So many things could be incorporated into this map: images, sounds, videos, interviews, all kinds of information that could be allocated to the points or other aspects of the map, in addition to what you've already done. Obviously, doing that is a colossal multi-year, maybe multi-decade job, but the potential here is so magnificent and rich. It's a privilege, I think, for us all to be on this webinar at the initial launch of this, because where it goes is going to be even more magnificent than the brilliance that already exists.
Thank you so much, Alex. And Daniel, maybe you want to respond just for a couple of minutes, maybe just 4 or 5 minutes, then we'll have time for some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you so very much to both of you. First of all, for participating. Second of all, for your interest over the years in the project. Third, for your very kind comments. And four, for your very thoughtful and probing questions and challenges. So it's so much appreciated. You've given me a lot to think about. I'll try to address some of the points right now. It's a little bit hard because there's so many things actually that I would love to address. I'll try to first turn to Yael. You raised the question of borders. I think one of the great things about a digital map as opposed to a print map is its potential to make all kinds of possibilities available without insisting upon them. And so I apologize that it isn't quite operational yet, but we're very close to actually offering a series of political maps such that the viewer can basically choose. Do they want to see Israel between 1948 and 1967, say? Or do they want to see the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century? Do they want to see the British Mandate? What do they want to see? And to make that available, just as we're making a series of plans available, and I hope, by the way, to incorporate ever more plans. They're beyond just the ones that we're very familiar with. There are many, many others. And so, yes, definitely want to make it possible for people at any stage in time, basically, not only to compare what existed with what people were proposing it might be nice to achieve in terms of some kind of resolution, but also what actually did exist in terms of political borders. So yes, absolutely. But I think I like the idea of them being options. And that, again, because we're dealing with such a vast range of time, and because I do want to sort of situate the map fundamentally in the, what I again call the Israeli-Palestinian region, there'll be options, but not requirements, let's say. So that's the first thing. To your point about the Mitzpim and the West Bank, the Mitzpim and the Galilee and the settlements in the West Bank, which really goes back to your question about the status of a point. So my point to that question really is, again, that I'm not quite there yet. There are a lot of things that I still would like to include, including especially on the front of unrecognized or legal communities. But I do want to include them, because the sort of the premise of all the points, or the aspiration of it, is to just sort of say, let's look at what existed at a particular point in time. If there was a Hilltop Youth, they established, they put some caravanim on some hill and they were there. All right. There were Bedouin who stuck out some territory in the negative and they were there. Fine. Because that does, if we're interested in what was the reality at any point in time, that was the reality in any point in time in terms of what communities existed. I am trying to also differentiate between things that were recognized and things that were not recognized, because I also think that's an important part of the story. So we have a category of unrecognized Arab communities, which is of course a very important part of the story of the history of the Arab community in Israel. But there are communities over time that from being unrecognized Arab communities became recognized communities, and I think that actually is an important thing to be able to visualize also, because who knows what insights can come from seeing that. And the same thing, I'd like to be able to see sort of illegal settlements on the West Bank that get legalized and so forth. Of course, some that were considered legal from the perspective of Israel nonetheless get removed anyway in the context of various plans. So I guess that's the other thing, is that legal and illegal are, they're sort of, in a sense, relative terms. I mean, whose legality, is sort of always the question. And that's in part why I know it sounded like you maybe are not so comfortable with the idea, but why I still actually, and I apologize if I'm disappointing you. Well, I don't apologize. I may be disappointing you, but I'll say it anyway. I do have one of the curated maps is still situated. I showed it very briefly in the presentation, the Mitzpim in the Galilee and the settlements in the West Bank. From my perspective, part of being a historian is putting things in dialogue with one another that maybe are typically seen as separate, especially when there's maybe a desire to see them as separate. I think from a certain perspective, there's certainly a very understandable insistence to say, oh, the Mitzvim in the Galilee, which for just so that everyone is on the same page here, which are communities, they're called Mitzvim. They're basically outlooks. They're typically on the tops of hills. These are perfectly legal. The state of Israel decided to establish these communities. Fine. Whereas the West Bank communities, that those violate international law, which forbids the settling of territories by one's own population that were occupied by force, and so forth. So there's a very sort of natural sort of position that one might fall back on, distinguishing in those ways. But at the same time, from an architectural, spatial perspective, there are actually, I think there are actually quite marked similarities. And those two settlement drives really got underway at the same point in time. So I think it's, again, as I said before, part of the goal is I do want to sort of challenge people a little bit with the curation, particularly of these maps. So to put them in dialogue with one another. I'm not saying, in doing so, I'm not trying to say that the Mitzvim in the Galilee are not legitimate, nor am I saying that the settlements in the West Bank are legitimate, nor am I saying that neither are legitimate. I just want to sort of put them together and to prompt thought and discussion and consideration of phenomena that do seem to overlap in interesting and perhaps somewhat fairly often overlooked ways. With regard to what is a point, I think I actually did sort of develop that. I'll just say, and I won't get into it now, but there is also just the other just practical question: at what point do you consider a point, a presence in the territory worthy of being worthy a point? A point by any other name would still be a point, but like what determines that something is qualified to be a point? Also, what happens when communities that were initially separate get combined into one municipality? And I'll just say, no pun intended, that I really work on a point-by-point basis. Each case really just has to be analyzed. What seems the most appropriate in this case? And if that seems like a bit of a cop-out, I'll just also say that no map can be perfectly, complete or comprehensive. I have slides, but I won't pull them up. I love the Borges story on exactitude in science. It may be the world's shortest story. It's just a paragraph, but it basically reports the efforts of map makers in some great empire, where they get so good at map making that they produce a map with a 1-to-1 ratio to the empire, which basically results in the abandonment of cartography as a pursuit. And Borges writes, if you still head out into the western deserts, you can still see ruins of of this great map out, lying around there, sort of like the Millennium Falcon in the more recent Star Wars films, just the ruins of it, out in the desert. Anyway, I love the image because with map making, and especially with digital map making, and this gets on to Alex now, there's always this tendency to like, oh, we could do this, we could do this, there's just, it's so, and it's great. And I also am always all the time thinking of, what else could we do? What else could we do? At the end of the day, though, I think what has to just sort of also bear in mind, there's only so much that in the end practically works. And in terms of what people are really going to use. And I think it gets very easy to just invest tons of time and resources in creating things that may not be, how much will people use them? So I'm not saying no to anything. And I very much like, and I've also thought of how great it would be if you click on a point and you can get access an interview of somebody, talking about growing up on that kibbutz, or hear a Palestinian narrative about what life was like in that village and so forth. I mean, there really are tremendous possibilities, and we'll see where it goes. One thing is clear: I really do need some help with this project going forward. I mean, it's been sort of like Solomon and I have been sort of the main people who've done this, but I mean, it's way too massive. I definitely need more people to be involved, and hopefully I can find the funding as we go forward to make that possible. I don't want to take up too much more time, but I just hope that I can just address Alex's other points very quickly. On the size question, I saw that this came up in the Q&A, and people always ask, well, wait, are you representing population? No, I'm not. Would there be a way of doing it? Maybe, but it couldn't be on a year-by-year basis. It just would be way too much data, and data that we often don't have. Maybe more for more recent periods, definitely thinking about it. But I think there also are other ways where size actually, it occurred to me as you were speaking, could also create could be helpful in other ways. So, for example, one thing that I've struggled with is how to represent, say, population or locations, excuse me, with significant Christian presence. You know, there's sort of several dozen Arab locales in Israel, and really just two, really, Taiba and Bethlehem, and Be'ah 3 and Beit Jala, I believe. And well, East Jerusalem, if you consider, you know, in the West Bank, that have significant Christian population. But I've sort of struggled with how to denote that where there's a significant, you know, presence of a group in a community. Maybe that would be, and I actually have it in the database, but we haven't quite, you know, I was thinking of having like a cross little icon behind the point, but then that's maybe, it's also, you don't want to like overload the viewer with things, but there would be a way like you could just sort of maybe push on something like see, you know, Christian presence, and those points would then get larger. And so they would like just help you register, oh, where are the places where Christian Arabs are most prevalent in the country, and so forth. So anyway, definitely thinking about size. But I will also say that something that I think, at least that for me, that I like about the fact that the points are all the same size is that it, in a way, and this is not really neutral, I think this is a place where I am providing a certain degree of curation, but I sort of like it. I'm in a way forcing the viewer to steer, to incline away from the main centers that we always talk about, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, or wherever, and to sort of, because I want them actually to like think about the other places that don't really get talked about so much. And I think in a post-October 7th world, that's, maybe we can understand that also a little bit better, because for a lot of the places that a lot of people didn't know about have now become places that they really do know about. And then finally, last thing on the neutrality, the ability of neutrality to undermine itself. Absolutely. And first of all, I want to make it clear to viewers out there, I'm trying to be as sensitive as possible. I can't claim to be completely neutral. I can't claim that the map is purely objective. There is no such thing. I mean, the very fact, I'll say it forthright, the very fact that I have basically one color for Arab communities and then several colors for Jewish communities, it does reveal something. So I will also hasten to add, I've considered doing a map where all the Jewish communities are in one color and the diverse kinds of Arab communities are in different colors. Totally open to that. But of course, the map does exist in a particular way right now. But I guess what I hope, and this goes back to what I said before, that I would hope that the map would challenge both kinds of viewers, is that I guess my point is that the neutrality undermining itself can work in both directions. So if we talk about, the sort of central thing, I think you went right to it, 1947 to 1949, all these villages disappear, all these new Jewish communities appear, no commentary, what is the viewer left to think? I can definitely anticipate a Palestinian critique that says, you basically, you depict the Nakba as if it's just, it just happened. All these villages are gone. You didn't talk about, ethnic cleansing or expulsion or so forth. I can see a very Zionist viewer looking at it and saying, you depict all these villages disappearing, but you don't, you didn't make it clear, like, there's no indication of like, say in the Jerusalem corridor, of how those villages were impeding, the provisioning of the Jewish community in Jerusalem and so forth. And so the viewer is going to basically, adopt a sort of pro-Palestinian perspective when they see all these green points suddenly disappear. I hope you see what I'm saying, is that the sort of, it's actually unclear in which way the neutrality undermines itself, because depending on the perspective of the viewer, it could work in different ways. And again, my hope is just that that people will that the map will just push them to reflect a little bit on where they come from and what their perspectives are. And again, all the more reason for me to hope that it will actually be used in pedagogical settings where informed teachers, and I speak right here to two of the most informed and seasoned teachers that I can imagine on this topic, are able to offer some context and explanation, and indeed countering perspectives on what the map depicts.
There's one question before we conclude that I think has come up multiple times from people in the Q&A, is what has been, and you kind of got into this maybe very briefly, what is the response from Arab scholars on this? And I know that you've consulted with some, and again, maybe just in a few minutes, you can just share some of those ideas.
Yeah, sure. Totally fair question. And I do also want to say that effort was made to to actually have an Arab perspective at this event. I regret that it didn't in the end work out. I need to reach out more, but I definitely have spoken with some. From some, I've had, actually quite positive and real interest. I actually have I presented or had Arab colleagues do something with the project in their classrooms in 2 cases. With an Arab Israeli scholar that I've been in touch with, there was also quite a positive, at least so far as I could tell, real interest and even an offer to collaborate and to contribute to the project, which made me very happy because, again, I'd like it to be the sort of resource that people, wherever they come from, wherever their perspective is, can see as valuable. In another case, there was definitely much more of a resistance. And one thing that I was criticized for is that that if you look on the map, I refer to Arab communities and I don't refer to Palestinian communities. And I will say I don't refer to Israeli. I mean, I refer to Jewish, but I don't identify specifically Israeli either. And look, I mean, I understand that why that could be upsetting for people. I did feel that, given that I'm encompassing a period from 1840 to the present, it seemed to me that it would be anachronistic to refer really to either national identity in the 19th century. And I didn't want to be the one making a determination as to say, when different populations in different places decided that they were really Palestinian, or even on the Jewish side, Israeli. So that's sort of where I am for now. I say this openly because I don't want people to feel like I'm hiding something, or I'm being open with a decision I made. If you feel differently about it, let me know. What you think. Again, there is a feedback opportunity place on the website, and yeah.
Thank you so much, Daniel Steinkucken, for sharing this wonderful project with us. We've put the link in the chat so people can actually go to the actual website. Our thanks to our respondents, Yael Zerubbabel and to Alexander Kay. And again, it was wonderful to be able to partner with the Schusterman Center. We hope this is the first of many. And also thank you to Solomon Weimel for participating as well. A recording of this gathering will be on our website shortly, so people can, again, refer to it. And all the comments that we have will be saved and will be sent to Daniel. And so we look forward to seeing this website growing and seeing how it will be used in the future. So thank you all very much.
And thank you again for this wonderful opportunity. Really appreciate it.